My daughter handed me a small wrapped box across the dinner table, her eyes shining with a pride I hadn't seen in years. It was a pair of high-end wireless earbuds, the kind I'd been admiring in shop windows, but never dared to buy for myself. Touched by her generosity, I wore them to the warehouse the very next morning, eager to show them off. I felt a renewed spring in my step, but that abruptly vanished during my lunch break. I was sitting in the break room when Miller, a grizzled old coworker and a former combat veteran, stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the device in my ear, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. He leaned in, his voice shaking, and whispered, "Ferdinand, take those out. You need to call the police, right now." I froze, confused, thinking it was some kind of twisted joke. I didn't react immediately. I just tried to keep my cool and walked away to the loading dock. But 4 days later, my world collapsed. If you have ever felt the ground fall out from under you because of a misunderstanding, please hit the like button. And if you believe truth always comes to light, share this story. Before I explain how a simple birthday gift destroyed my life, let me take you back to where it all began. And please, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It helps me feel less alone in telling this. To understand the gravity of that moment in the break room, you have to understand the bond I share with my daughter, Diana. Since my wife passed 5 years ago, it has just been the two of us against the world here in Denver. Diana is 22, a nursing student who works double shifts at a diner just to keep her tuition payments from bouncing. She is the kind of young woman who would give you the coat off her back even if she was freezing. I raised her to value integrity over easy money, a lesson that sometimes felt like a curse in the cutthroat world we live in. I worked as a shift supervisor at a massive logistics distribution center. It wasn't glamorous work. It was loud, dusty, and physically demanding, but it paid the mortgage. I prided myself on running a tight ship. I checked every manifest, secured every seal, and treated my team with respect. In an industry rife with corner cutting, I was the old guard, the man who refused to look the other way. I often thought about how fragile honesty is. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation, and only a second to shatter it. I didn't know then that my own reputation was already in the crosshairs, targeted by people I shook hands with every single day. The atmosphere at the warehouse had changed 6 months prior when corporate sent down a new regional manager named Gavin. Gavin was a man who wore suits that cost more than my car and smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes. He was obsessed with efficiency and inventory liquidity, corporate buzzwords that usually meant firing good people and ignoring safety protocols. Under his watch, inventory counts started getting fuzzy. High-value electronics would vanish from the system, marked as damaged in transit, only to never be seen in the scrap pile. I had raised concerns, of course. That was my job. I sent emails to Gavin asking for clarification on missing shipments of high-tech audio equipment and military-grade comms gear. Gavin always waved me off, calling me a dinosaur who didn't understand modern logistics. "Relax, Ferdinand," he'd say, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "It's just a counting lag. Stop worrying about the numbers and worry about your retirement." Looking back, that wasn't advice. It was a threat. I was the obstacle in his path, the squeaky wheel that needed to be greased or replaced. I just never imagined he would use my own family to do it. My 55th birthday fell on a Tuesday. I came home exhausted, my boots heavy with the dust of the warehouse floor. The house was dark, but the smell of pot roast, my favorite, filled the air. Diana jumped out from the kitchen, surprising me with a small cake and that beautifully wrapped box. We didn't have much money for celebrations, so the gesture meant the world to me. We sat at the kitchen table, the candlelight flickering against the peeling paint of the walls. And for a moment, the stress of Gavin and the warehouse melted away. "I saved up for 3 months," Diana said, sliding the box toward me. "I know you like listening to your audiobooks on the bus. These are the best ones on the market. Noise canceling, top-tier range." I opened the box to reveal the sleek, matte black earbuds. They looked expensive. Too expensive. "Diana, honey, you shouldn't have," I said, a lump forming in my throat. She just beamed. "I found a great deal online, Dad. A liquidation sale. Don't worry about the price. You deserve nice things." I put them in, and the silence was instant. The world fell away. I felt loved. I felt seen. I had no idea that I had just placed the evidence of a felony directly into my ears. The days following my birthday were a blur of happiness. I wore the earbuds everywhere, listening to history podcasts during my commute and on my breaks. I felt modern, connected. But the atmosphere at work was growing tense. Security guards were doing random locker checks, and Gavin was locked in his office for hours at a time. Then came the interaction with Miller, the veteran who warned me. I brushed it off as Miller being paranoid. He still suffered from PTSD and often saw threats where there were none. I went home that Friday thinking the worst of the week was behind me. I was sitting in my recliner, the earbuds on the side table, watching the evening news. Diana was in the kitchen making tea. Suddenly, the front door exploded inward. A SWAT team, gear heavy and weapons drawn, flooded our small living room. I was thrown to the floor, my hands zip-tied before I could even draw a breath. I screamed for an explanation, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't looking for me. They marched into the kitchen and dragged a terrified Diana out in handcuffs, reading her rights for grand larceny and trafficking of restricted military technology. If you have ever felt the crushing weight of injustice, watching someone you love suffer, please subscribe to this channel. We are building a community that stands for truth, and your support helps us tell these stories. The scene was chaos. My neighbors were on their porches, phones out, recording the disgrace of my life. I was released on sight, but Diana was shoved into the back of a squad car, her face pressed against the glass, sobbing, mouthing, "I didn't know, Daddy, I didn't know." As the lights faded into the distance, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my front door, a detective stayed behind. He was a stern man with tired eyes. He picked up the earbuds from the side table with a gloved hand and dropped them into an evidence bag. "Do you know what these are, Ferdinand?" he asked. "These aren't consumer electronics. This is a prototype communication set stolen from a military shipment your warehouse was supposed to secure last week. They have built-in trackers, and your daughter's credit card is tied to the purchase from a black market fence we've been tracking for months." My knees gave out. I collapsed onto the sofa. The liquidation sale Diana had found wasn't a sale at all. It was a trap. But how did a 22-year-old nursing student accidentally buy military prototypes? It didn't make sense. The pieces didn't fit, unless someone made them fit. The next morning, I arrived at the police station before the sun came up. They wouldn't let me see her. They told me she was being processed and that the federal agents were on their way. Federal agents. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I needed a lawyer, a good one, but my savings account held less than $2,000. I called every public defender listed in the phone book until one finally agreed to meet me. He was young, overworked, and smelled of stale coffee. But he was all we had. I went to work later that day, not because I wanted to, but because I needed answers. As soon as I scanned my badge, the red light flashed. Access denied. A security guard, one of Gavin's new hires, stepped out of the booth. "You're done here, Ferdinand. Gavin wants you in his office to sign your termination papers. Escort required." I was marched through the warehouse floor like a criminal. The eyes of the men and women I had supervised for a decade burned into my back. Some looked away in shame. Others looked at me with disgust. Rumors travel faster than light in a warehouse. They all thought I was the thief. Gavin was sitting behind his mahogany desk, looking mournfully at a stack of papers. It was a performance. "I'm disappointed, Ferdinand," he sighed, not even offering me a seat. "I always knew you were struggling with retirement funds. But to involve your daughter in a theft ring? Stealing from our military contracts? That's a new low." "I didn't steal anything, and neither did she," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "She bought a gift online. She's a victim." Gavin chuckled darkly. "The paper trail says otherwise. We found digital logs on your workstation, Ferdinand, accessing the secure cage codes. It looks like you pulled the product and she fenced it. The police have the logs. It's over." He slid a paper across the desk. "Sign this. It admits nothing, just acknowledges you're firing for cause. If you sign, maybe the company won't sue you for civil damages on top of the criminal charges." I looked at his smug face, the face of a man who had won. I realized then that the accounting lag wasn't lag. It was a setup. He needed a fall guy for the missing inventory, and he had spent months building a frame around me. The weeks that followed were a descent into hell. Diana was released on bail, thanks to a lien I took out on the house, but she was a shell of herself. The nursing school suspended her pending the investigation. She spent her days in her room, staring at the wall, terrified of a prison sentence that could last 10 years. I couldn't find work. Who hires a 55-year-old logistics manager under investigation for grand larceny? We survived on ramen noodles and the charity of the local food bank, hiding our faces when we went to pick up the boxes. The isolation was the hardest part. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid us. We were pariahs. I spent my nights going over the timeline, trying to find the crack in Gavin's armor. But he had covered his tracks perfectly. He had used my login credentials, which, as a supervisor, I had to share with management occasionally, to falsify the records. It was his word against mine, and he had the corporate lawyers and the digital evidence. I felt a darkness creeping in, a despair that whispered to me to just give up, to take a plea deal, to save Diana. One rainy Tuesday, I was sitting on a park bench, staring at the gray sky, when a shadow fell over me. It was Miller, the veteran from the warehouse. He was wearing a hoodie and looking nervously over his shoulder. He sat down at the other end of the bench, not looking at me. "I can't stay long," he muttered. "Gavin has eyes everywhere. He fired the night security team and brought in his own guys." "Why are you here, Miller?" I asked, too tired for anger. "Because I know what those earbuds were," Miller said. "I served in a comms unit. That tech, it's not just valuable, it's specific. It has a localized frequency for squad chatter. But here's the thing, Ferdinand. That shipment never actually arrived at the warehouse." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The logs say I stole it from the secure cage." "The logs are fake," Miller whispered. "I worked the receiving dock. I saw the manifest. The military crates were light, empty. Gavin didn't steal them from the warehouse. He stole them before they got there, or he's working with a supplier. He planted those specific units online for your daughter to buy. He targeted her IP address. He fished for her." Miller's words lit a fire in my belly that I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just a frame job. It was a predator hunting his prey. Gavin had stalked my family's digital footprint. He knew Diana was looking for a gift. He knew my birthday was coming. It was sick. It was personal. "How do we prove it?" I asked. "There is a secondary manifest," Miller said. "The driver's physical log. It's old school. Paper. Gavin thinks everything is digital, so he didn't scrub the hard copies in the archives in the basement. But the archives are scheduled to be shredded on Friday." It was Wednesday. We had 2 days. 2 days to break into a building I was banned from, find a piece of paper that might not exist, and save my daughter's life. I looked at Miller. "Why help me? You could lose your pension." Miller looked at me, his eyes hard. "Because you were the only boss who didn't treat me like a broken toy. And because I took an oath to protect the innocent. I don't untake it just because I clocked out." The plan was desperate and dangerous. Miller would leave the side fire exit of the warehouse propped open during the shift change at 3:00 a.m. I knew the layout of the building better than I knew the layout of my own home. I dug out my old uniform, the one they hadn't stripped off me, and a pair of dark gloves. Diana saw me preparing in the kitchen. She didn't ask me to stop. She just hugged me, her grip tight and desperate. "Come back," she whispered. "Please just come back." I walked through the dark streets of Denver, the cold air biting my face. Every shadow looked like a police officer. Every car sound made me jump. I was a law-abiding citizen about to commit burglary. But the law had failed me. The system had failed me. Sometimes, justice is something you have to take for yourself, stealing it back from the people who hid it away. I reached the warehouse perimeter. It loomed against the night sky like a fortress. I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence that I'd meant to report for repair months ago. Ironic how my own oversight was now my salvation. I waited by the dumpsters, the smell of rotting cardboard and oil filling my nose. At 3:00 a.m. exactly, the heavy steel door clicked and cracked open an inch. Miller was good to his word. I slipped inside. The warehouse was a cathedral of shadows. The hum of the refrigeration units was deafening in the silence. I moved toward the basement archives, keeping to the blind spots of the cameras I had helped install. My heart was thundering so loud, I was sure it would trigger the motion sensors. I reached the archive room door. Locked. Of course. I pulled out a tension wrench, a tool from my hobbyist days, and went to work on the lock. Sweat dripped into my eyes. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Click. The archive room smelled of dust and secrets. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness. I had a flashlight with a red filter to minimize the glow. I needed the receiving Q3 binder. I scanned the shelves frantically. Q1, Q2. The spot for QE was empty. My stomach dropped. Gavin had gotten there first. I fell to my knees, shining the light under the shelves, praying for a miracle. Then I saw it. Not the binder, but a loose sheet of paper that had slipped behind the metal racking. It was a driver's handoff note. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was dated the day of the alleged shipment. In scrawled handwriting, the driver had written, "Shipment weight discrepancy, 40 lbs underweight. Manager Gavin signed off on blind receipt. Instructed not to weigh." There was Gavin's signature. He had accepted the empty boxes knowingly. He had authorized the fraud before the boxes even entered the building. This piece of paper proved he knew the inventory was missing before I was ever accused of stealing it. I folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket, turning to leave. The lights in the room suddenly blazed to life. I spun around, blinded. Gavin stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his private security goons. He wasn't smiling this time. He was holding a taser. "I knew you'd come back, Ferdinand," he spat. "Rats always come back for the cheese. Miller is a terrible liar. I saw him on the camera propping the door." My blood ran cold. "Where's Miller?" "He's being dealt with," Gavin said, stepping forward. "And now, so are you. Breaking and entering? Industrial espionage? The police are going to find you here, resisting arrest. Whatever happens next is self-defense." The guards moved in. I was 55, not a fighter. But I had a daughter to save. I threw the heavy metal tape dispenser from the nearest desk at the fire alarm pull station on the wall. The glass shattered. The klaxons began to scream. The sprinklers overhead burst open, drenching the room in a chaotic downpour of dirty water. In the confusion, I ran. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the server room. The water was soaking everything, creating a fog. The guard slipped on the wet tile. I slammed into the server room, locking the heavy door behind me. I knew it would only hold for minutes. I pulled out my phone and took a high-resolution photo of the document. Then I did the one thing Gavin didn't expect. I didn't call the police. I called the military liaison number listed on the emergency contact sheet pinned to the wall, a number I had memorized years ago for critical incidents. "This is Ferdinand, ID number 4922, I shouted over the alarm. "I am in the server room at the logistics hub. I have proof of contract fraud and theft of classified assets by the site manager. I am being hunted by private security. Send the MPs." I heard the guards pounding on the door. The metal buckled. I slumped against the racks of humming servers, clutching the wet piece of paper to my chest, and waited. The door gave way with a deafening crash. The guards rushed in, batons raised. I curled into a ball, protecting the evidence. The first blow struck my shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down my arm. But before the second blow could land, a voice boomed over the facility PA system. Not the fire alarm, but a megaphone. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, lie on the ground." The response had been fast, faster than regular police. The military takes theft of their technology very seriously. The guards froze. Gavin, standing in the doorway, turned pale. He tried to run, to blend into the evacuating night shift workers, but he didn't make it 10 feet. I watched from the floor as men in tactical gear swarmed the hallway. They weren't there to arrest the thief. They were there to secure the asset. And for the first time in months, the asset wasn't the earbuds. It was me. The following days were a whirlwind of legal vindication. The document I found, combined with Miller's testimony, he had been beaten but was alive, blew the case wide open. The forensic accountants found Gavin's offshore accounts within 48 hours. He hadn't just framed me. He had been selling military tech to foreign buyers for years, using the liquidation sites to launder the money through unsuspecting buyers like my daughter. The charges against Diana were dropped with prejudice. The district attorney personally apologized to her. The police returned the earbuds, though we smashed them with a hammer in the backyard just to be sure. I was offered my job back with a substantial raise and back pay. I stood in the warehouse, looking at the spot where Miller had warned me. The air smelled the same. The machinery hummed the same tune. But I was different. I declined the job offer. I took the settlement money from the wrongful termination lawsuit and paid off the house. I paid for Diana's nursing school tuition in full. I couldn't work for a company that had allowed a monster to thrive, even if the monster was gone. Miller retired too. We meet for coffee every Tuesday. We don't talk much about that night. But there is a silent understanding between us. We are the survivors of a war fought in the aisles of a logistics center. Diana finished her degree. She works in the ER now. She's tough. tougher than she was before. She learned that the world isn't fair, that kindness can be weaponized. But she also learned that her father would burn down the world to save her. And that is a lesson worth more than any gift. I still think about that birthday. It was supposed to be a celebration of life, and it almost became the end of ours. It taught me that trust is a currency you should spend sparingly. We assume that authority figures are right, that the system works, and that truth protects us. But sometimes, truth is just a piece of paper hiding behind a metal shelf, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. We live in a world where innocence is no defense against power. But we also live in a world where a father's love is stronger than a corrupt manager's greed.